Okay, Aaron, you're on.
All right, like Bob said, this is an HBLT talk, so a big part of HBLT is audience participation. So when I ask a question, it most likely isn't rhetorical. So for example, Seth, as he takes a bite, Seth, you were a swimmer in high school, right?
Yep.
And how long did you swim for, roughly?
15 years.
15 years. All right. So if I say the words 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics, what comes to mind?
Phelps.
Michael Phelps. And what did Michael Phelps do?
I set the butterfly record.
Set the butterfly record. What else happened? Does anyone else know? Set the freestyle record. What else happened?
He got 8 gold medals?
He won 8 gold medals. And I don't know if you guys know, that's a lot of gold medals. He broke the previous record of 7 gold medals, also set by a swimmer in 1974. And I think that's probably the most dominant athlete I've ever seen in my lifespan, probably in history, to win every event he was in. That includes relays, the butterfly, freestyle, all that stuff. He won in every category he was in. He went 8 for 8, the best of the best, in a 2-week span in the summer of 2008. But I think it's really cool. I think it's awesome. That's one of the, like I said, greatest showings of athleticism I've ever seen. But what about the 4 years prior, in between Olympics? What was Michael Phelps doing? Seth, what was he doing? As you take another bite.
He was training.
He was training, right. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some of the workouts and the average day and week for Michael Phelps. Michael Phelps swam a minimum of 80,000 meters a week, which is about 50 miles a week, minimum, in the pool. Then he would get out of the pool and exercise, do some weightlifting in the gym for about an hour to an hour and a half a day. Then he would close with 500 reps of an ab exercise, whether it was sit-ups, crunches, balancing, something like that. And he did this 6 hours a day for 6 days a week for at least the 4 years prior to the 2008 Olympics. For breakfast, he would eat 3 fried egg sandwiches with cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, fried onions, and mayonnaise, 2 cups of coffee, 1 5-egg omelet, 1 bowl of grain, 3 slices of French toast, and 3 chocolate chip pancakes. That was breakfast. For lunch, he would eat a pound of pasta, 2 large ham and cheese sandwiches with mayonnaise on white bread, plus about 4 energy drinks that would supply him with another 1,000 calories. That was lunch. For dinner, he would again have a pound of pasta, an entire pizza, and about 3 to 4 more energy drinks. That's how he got to be probably the greatest Olympian and athlete, I would argue, of all time. But we don't look at that, do we? We don't look at the 4 years prior. We don't examine that. We saw what he did in 2008. It was phenomenal. We've seen what he's done over his career at the various Olympic Games throughout his life. But we don't focus on the 6 hours of exercise a day, 50 miles a week in the pool, 500 ab exercises, a gazillion eggs, and a ton of pasta. We focus on the big thing. And I think that's great. But I think we kind of do the same thing when we look at the life of Christ. I think we do. And I don't think it's wrong to look at all the signs and miracles he performed and see how obvious it was that he was the Messiah. But I think we kind of miss out on the everyday Jesus when we're only focusing on those things. To give a little context for our story today, I told Daniel earlier that I would be teaching and not preaching. This is a teaching lesson. I am not preaching, mainly because I'm actually going to be drawing from all 4 Gospels. This is one of the only miracles that happens in all 4 Gospels. The other one would be the resurrection of Christ. And we find this miracle in Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 12, and John 6. And we're going to start in Matthew 14, if you guys want to turn there, starting in verse 13. And we're going to give, while you do that, I'm going to give a little context of what's going on in Jesus' life right now. He's kind of in the middle of his ministry. He's about 2 years in, and he's performing miracles. He's kind of on tour, as it were, with his disciples. He's going to various towns all around, and he's healing sick people. He's proclaiming who he is and what he's kind of there for. And some of the miracles he just performed, he had just healed a man on the Sabbath, which, if you guys know anything about Jewish customs, that was to do any work on the Sabbath was a no-no. But an even bigger no-no, the passage before this in most of the Gospels, Jesus has just claimed equality with the Father. which again, in the realm of Judaism, that's not okay. We don't do that. And we find ourselves in this story, and we're going to start in Matthew 14, verse 13, and we find that Jesus is catering again. We all know his first miracle was what? What was the first miracle Jesus did? Turning water into wine, right, at the party. And we also see some other examples of him working with food. So he's pretty handy in the kitchen, you might say. And we see, this is a very familiar story in all the Gospels. I'm sure you've heard it at least once, and probably had to teach it at least once if you work with kids. And I think there's some things in here that we miss. And going through preparation for today, I wanted to choose one passage that I thought described what was going on best, but I just couldn't. I couldn't ignore the other Gospels without drawing some pieces from them, because they each have such unique things to say. So we're going to start in Matthew 14, verse 13. Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him there on foot from the cities. So we open with, now Jesus had just heard about John. John who? John the Baptist, the preparer of the way for Jesus. Jesus' cousin, he's very close to John. John is the man who literally was born to prepare the way for Jesus' ministry, right? And we see John even gets to baptize Jesus after preaching about him for a while, and John gets imprisoned and is eventually beheaded by Herod. So this affects Jesus. We got to remember he is fully God, but he's also fully man. He has emotion. He has emotion. And he takes time here. He says to his disciples to get in a boat, and we're going to go to the other side because I need to be by myself. I need some time to grieve. But the people see what he's doing and just going to the other side, and I can just imagine Jesus is lying down, and Peter taps him on the shoulder, and he points, and he just sees the crowds running around the lake waiting for him on the other side. And this is where our story kind of picks up. John has just died. Jesus is grieving. Now we're going to jump in. And if you guys would turn with me to Mark 6. Mark 6, verse 34. We're going to be turning our Bibles a lot today, so I hope you did your finger exercises this morning. Mark 6, verse 34. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. We see that John has just died. He's in a boat. He's grieving. People are coming around. And for me, I have a relative just died. The guy who I'm very close to has maybe gotten me into Moody or something. He has just died. That man has just died. In the same day I'm grieving, all these people are just waiting for me. Just waiting for me to get to the other side. I would not be as open as Jesus, where I'd be like, okay, turn the boat around, we're going to the other side. We're going to turn around and go and find anywhere I can get away. But that's not what he does. It says, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He realizes that his need to grieve does not weigh more than their need to know about him. It is far worse for them to go away not knowing who he is than for him to have this time of grief. Most of the time when a relative dies, usually it's 3 or 4 days to maybe 3 or 4 weeks, that period of grieving we give people. Jesus gets probably 3 or 4 hours. And he realizes that there is a need here. He feels compassion for them because they're like sheep without a shepherd. They're going about their daily lives without knowing who God really is. And like I said, that is far worse than anything else going on in Jesus' life right now. Even though John has just died, his period of grieving has been interrupted, but he still chooses to show them compassion when it's ridiculously inconvenient. I don't know about you, but that's kind of a theme throughout the life of Christ that I see. Right from his incarnation, coming down, and being born unto Mary, that's a little inconvenient for God. But he shows compassion. Or maybe when he takes time to even discuss with a Gentile woman, right? We see that he says, well, this is actually just for Israel. And she's like, no, can this be for me too? And he says, yes. It's inconvenient. It's not directly maybe part of the plan right at that moment, but he makes sure he knows, and that they know, who he is. Compassion. Next, we're going to jump to Luke chapter 9, verses 12 through 17. I know we're jumping around a lot, but I promise there is a point at the end. Luke puts together actually one of the most detailed of the Gospels. It's pretty long, lengthy chapters, and there's a lot of detail in here because most scholars would say that Luke probably drew from a couple eyewitnesses that he's compiling all this information for some non-believers so that they can know who God is as well. So Luke 9, verse 12, and we're going to go through 17. Now when the day was ending, and the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away, so that they might go into the surrounding villages and countryside, and find lodging and get something to eat. For we are here in a desolate place." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. Unless perhaps we go and buy food for all these people," for there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down to eat in groups of about 50 each." They did so, and had them all sit down. Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looking up to heaven, he blessed them, and he broke them, kept giving them to the disciples to set before the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. And the broken pieces which they had left over were 12 baskets full. So Luke gives us details to what's going on in the story. He kind of gets down, gives us a play-by-play of what's happening. We see the day is ending. Jesus is, he has compassion on the crowd. The Gospels say that he was teaching people about him, and he was actually healing people as well, and meeting those spiritual needs and teaching about himself and the kingdom of God and what it kind of means to be a follower of Jesus. And the disciples come to him. I can just imagine Jesus is having a really long day. He learns that John the Baptist has died. He wants time to grieve. He doesn't get it, so he decides to teach instead. He's teaching to the end of the day, and the disciples come to him and be like, "We don't have any food for these people." And he says, "You give them something to eat." And when I read this the first time, I thought that Jesus is kind of being a little bit snarky and kind of sarcastic to the disciples. But what I really think what is happening is he's telling them, like, how much faith do you have in me? Where is this going? Do you think I can do this? I've been healing people. Lame men have been walking. Blind men have been seeing. I've been teaching. And you're concerned about the food. Okay, and then he says, okay, we're gonna deal with this. He says, I'll take care of it. And he has them sit down, and has the 5,000 men sit down and prepare for the food. And we see in the other Gospels it says there was a boy there who had the 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? And these 5 loaves, it says in other Gospels, were made of barley. And I don't know if you guys know anything about barley, but that's usually what you feed horses. That is not delicious rolls of bread like your mom makes. It's not great. Some people like barley soup. Some people do like eating barley, but it's not high-class stuff, not high-quality stuff. And the 2 fish are most likely like lake trout or bass, so they're pretty small. These aren't big fish. This is all this kid has. But Jesus takes it, and what does he do? He blesses the food. He gives thanks for the food. Some of the other Gospels and other translations say he gives thanks for the food. He's had this long day. He has to do something again, and he still takes time to thank his Father for what he has in that situation. Jesus knows what he's going to do with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He knows that his power is coming from the Father now that he has assumed also a human form as well. He's 100% God, 100% man, but you learn in systematic theology here that he had to put some of the stuff kind of to the side, right? He couldn't do everything that God does, so he submitted to the will of the Father, and he knows where it's coming from. He knows where this food is coming from, and he stops and he thanks the Father for where this is coming from. These 5 barley loaves and 2 lake trout. He says thank you. He blesses the food, and it is multiplied, and everybody is satisfied. And now we're going to jump to John 6. John chapter 6, verse 14. John 6, verse 14. We know John is a direct disciple of Christ. He's known as the one whom Jesus loved. And he was very, very close to Jesus. And he ends his tale of the feeding of the 5,000 with something that the other Gospels leave out. And he ends with, therefore, when the people had saw the sign which he had performed, they said, this is truly the prophet who has come into the world. John doesn't reference this as, he admits this is miraculous. Jesus is taking nothing, turning it into something for all these people to eat and enjoy, and this is all we're satisfied. But he calls it a sign. And what does a sign do? When you're driving, what does a sign do? Helps you. Okay, what else does a sign do? Driving along the side of the road. Directions. It points to what you're going towards. It points to what you're going towards. And that's what Jesus is doing here. And I don't think it's that John, yes, he is talking about the feeding of the 5,000, but I don't think we're also supposed to miss everything else Jesus does prior to that from the other Gospels. From John, him hearing about John dying, having compassion, being thankful, yes, he does feed the 5,000, but there's all this prior stuff that we don't always acknowledge is going on in the text. And this is actually the first time that the people are realizing that Jesus is the Messiah. He is who he says he is. He's realizing, like I said, he's been on tour doing these miracles and signs, and he's realizing, and people are realizing he is who he says he is because of what he's going around and what he's doing. They're kind of, I imagine they're talking to each other and they're like, remember when we were younger and we had to like memorize Isaiah, and there was this talk about this guy that was going to come, or we were talking to Micah, there's this guy that's going to come. They're starting to put the pieces together. They're starting to figure out, oh, this guy, we've known he's coming for a while, and maybe this is the guy. I think this is the guy. And we realize that as Christians, I think we need to realize that everything Jesus is doing is because he was the Messiah. Not just these signs to prove he was the Messiah. He's doing everything in the 3 years of ministry, everything we have written down before us, intentionally pointing the way of that him being the Messiah and what we need to do about it. And we're actually going to jump into some applications. So turn to John 20, verses 30 and 31. John 20, 30 and 31. John is starting to wrap up this gospel. This is after they have found the empty tomb. Everything's kind of getting wrapped up as far as the gospel goes, as far as Jesus' life goes. And John gives the reasoning for why he wrote what he wrote. Yes, he worked, obviously, we believe that the Holy Spirit had a lot of say in this and kind of gave John some inspiration, but these are John's words as well. And he says, therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. I would love, when we get to heaven, if we had a book of every miracle that Jesus did while he was on earth. John calls it a book that it could be filled again and again and again and again and again of all the things that Jesus, all the miracles and signs and wonders that Jesus performed while he was here on earth. But John doesn't include those for some reason. And he writes, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The very reason for John writing this book, and I would argue the gospel writers writing at all, is to show who Jesus is to the non-believer. We have Matthew writing to the Jews. We have Luke writing basically a very detailed history of Jesus' life to a non-believer. And we also have John writing about what he has seen. Right? And we are called, I think, as Christians, yes, these are written so that we believe who the Son of God is, but once we believe who the Son of God is, as Christians, what are we supposed to do? That's not a rhetorical question. What are we supposed to do once we believe in Christ? What are we supposed to do? Our sanctification process starts. We're supposed to be walking like Christ. And I think a lot of times, like I said earlier, we focus on these big signs that Jesus performed. Yes, it speaks to the power of God. Yes, it speaks to Jesus being submissive to the will of the Father, and in that process working itself out. But once we believe in Jesus, then there's some implications there that we need to take care of. And I think the Bible backs me up on this. Turn really quick. Seth, I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians 11:1. Dylan, can you turn to 1 John 2:6? And Daniel, can you please turn to 1 Peter 2:21. Seth, you got it?
Yep.
Okay, 1 Corinthians 11:1. What does it say?
Be imitators of me as I am of Christ.
There, Paul is writing a letter to the church in Corinth, right? And he's explaining what it means to be a Christian. He says, I'm doing my best to follow what I have written before me, and you guys need to do the same thing. Dylan, 1 John 2:6.
1 John 2:6. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked.
Again, we see John backing up what he's saying. He's saying, once you believe, this is what you need to do. You need to walk in the same way Christ walked. You need to pick up on this everyday stuff, because these signs and wonders they're through the power of the Father. They still happen, but these aren't everyday things that are happening. But I think having compassion on someone is an everyday occurrence. I think being thankful in a not great situation is an everyday occurrence. And Danny, would you please read 1 Peter 2:21?
For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving an example for you to follow in his footsteps.
Again, we see Peter backing up this statement. He's saying, once you believe in Christ, this is what you're supposed to do about it. You're supposed to look at his life, look at the everyday Jesus, everything he's doing. Yes, we need to look at the signs and the wonders. That's how we know Jesus is the Messiah. But we need to look at all these things in between, or we'll miss it and we won't find our way. Would you please pass those up? Okay, so this is where practical application comes in. I talked about Jesus showing compassion when it was incredibly inconvenient, everyday life thing. And also Jesus' thankfulness in the story. So on the side with lines, I want you guys to take a minute, and I want you guys to write, just today, since you've been up, Seth probably at 5:30 in the morning to hit the gym, everybody, please write the entire list of things today that you're thankful for. The next one, I want fill out just fill out the side with the lines, please. All right, you guys can go ahead and stop. Belle, what's something you wrote? What are you thankful for today?
I'm thankful for sunshine.
Thankful for sunshine. Very good, very good. Grace, what's something you're thankful for today?
Friendship.
Friendship. Caroline, something you're thankful for today?
I remain happy and peaceful.
That's it. That's always a positive. Ruthie, what are you thankful for today?
Cooking skills.
Cooking skills. Okay, now flip the card over, please. And on the top, I want you guys to write the word compassion. Write the word compassion. And I want you to underline it. Then put a bullet point in the first section there under the word. Maybe a little circle or a 1 with a dot next to it. And I want you guys to write the name of somebody. And I know who this is for me, and I don't know if everyone has them. Write the name of the person you have failed to show compassion to, maybe this week, maybe this semester, and you really struggle showing compassion to. And I don't mean just people who don't know Jesus. I mean, maybe it's your roommate who all he does is complains about the 3 presentations, 2 papers, and the exam he had this week. And you try to outdo him in that way. Maybe it was complaining. Maybe someone is missing out on an event or something, but you've had to miss out on 3 this semester, and you try to outdo them in that. And I want you guys to take this with you, put it in your pocket, put it in the backpack. Don't put it on your mirror. I want you guys to keep this with you, and every time you struggle to show compassion to somebody, I want you to put another bullet point and write their name down. Every time. This is not my idea. This is something my youth pastor had us do. And when I was 16, I filled the 3x5 card in 2 days. But I'm also a very big complainer. And so I think the application here is that when we have thankful hearts and compassionate hearts and they come together, that outlines for us what good Christian charity looks like. We see Jesus meeting, yes, he's meeting the needs of people, but he has compassion when it's really inconvenient. And we see him being thankful when there's really not that much to be thankful for. And I think that is our everyday Jesus that I think we sometimes miss out on. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. I really liked your energy. I liked your eye contact. You were a little bit quick, but it was okay. It wasn't like that was inappropriate. I think the opening illustration was very interesting, the Michael Phelps thing. What you didn't do as much as I would have liked was to have you involve the audience more in the book section. Involving the audience more is more than just having them read a text. It's asking questions so that they are discovering the truth for themselves. The only time you really asked the question that was quasi-related to the actual text was what's a sign for, and so that was where the HBLT thing could have done more. But it was a good lesson in a lot of different ways. Thank you.